and thank you for joining us. I will kick us off just with a warm welcome to all of you. My name is Mary Eleanor Power, and I am the Director of Marketing and Communications for Dalhousie University's Faculty of Open Learning and Career Development. And I'm delighted that you could join us today for a webinar hosted by Camille Dundas, How to Practice Allyship in the Workplace. I will begin by acknowledging that Dalhousie University is located in Mi'kmaq, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. We are all treaty people. And I would also like to recognize that African Nova Scotians are a distinct people whose histories, legacies, and contributions have enriched that part of Mi'kmaq known as Nova Scotia for over 400 years. And I would love to pass it on now to Camille Dundas, who I'm sure will tell you a lot about herself. Camille is one of our instructors of our Foundations of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, one of our most popular courses. She is a wonderful speaker, and we've had the chance to have her join us for a webinar a few months ago. So if you were able to join that one, that's fantastic, and we welcome you back. Camille, I will pass it over to you, and feel free to add any questions in the chat, and enjoy, everyone. Thanks, Camille.
Thank you so much, Mary Elizabeth. Hello to everyone, wherever you're joining from. I'm glad you've chosen to be here with us today. Again, my name is Camille Dundas, and I apologize. I am battling a cold, so if I sound a little bit weird, I'm powering through. My pronouns are she, her. I am the founder and principal educator of The Idea Practice. We're a group of Canadian educators and facilitators offering Canada's first online micro-credential course in equity, diversity, and inclusion through Dalhousie University called Inclusive Communications. And the course takes a pretty unique approach that tackles uncomfortable topics with historical context grounded in specifically Canadian context and real life examples. Talk a little bit more about that later, but I first want to acknowledge that I'm living and working on Indigenous lands. I'm located in Durham, Ontario, which is covered under the Williams Treaties and the traditional territory of the Mississauga, a branch of the Anishinaabe Nation, including Algonquin, Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi. Many of us have also come to these lands we know as Canada as settlers, immigrants, and newcomers in this generation and generations past. I also want to acknowledge those who came here to these lands forcibly, particularly as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. So I honor and pay tribute to our ancestors of African origin and descent. Okay, today we're talking about allyship, practicing allyship in the workplace. So what is allyship? It is the active, consistent, and arduous practice of unlearning and reevaluating in which a person in a position of privilege and power seeks to operate in solidarity with a marginalized group. It's important to remember that no matter your background, you are capable of practicing allyship. And as you may know, there are many different forms of allyship. Today, I'll be focusing on allyship mainly in the context of combating anti-Black racism in the workplace. But remember that every strategy I talk about today can be applied to practicing allyship with any and all marginalized groups. And reality is we have many marginalized groups: women, 2S LGBTQIA plus communities, Jewish people, Indigenous peoples, people with disabilities, neurodiverse communities, new immigrant communities, and many, many others. Saying you're an ally is much easier than practicing allyship. And notice I say practicing because it is a practice, because there will be times when you don't get it right, but I don't want you to stop practicing. And saying you're an ally looks very good on paper, especially if you're never questioned about your own inaction. Anyone has the potential to practice allyship. And allies, they recognize that even though they're not a member of an underinvested or an oppressed community, that they can support, they can make a concerted effort to better understand the struggles or barriers of that group every single day. And they use their own privileges to create change. Now, I know that this term, privilege, and particularly the term white privilege, makes some people deeply uncomfortable. White privilege does not imply that white people cannot or have never faced struggle or hardship, but it does mean that of all the hardships you faced in life, being white was likely not one of them. You have faced hardships, but you have not faced hardships simply because you are white. Whereas Black, Indigenous, and racialized folks face all the same hardships you faced, and on top of that, additional challenges simply because of their skin color. Like, for example, they don't have the privilege of unquestioned inclusion. For example, when a white person walks into a building, it's very unlikely that security will question their presence there. Whereas a Black, Indigenous, or a person of color, they are much more likely to be stopped and asked for identification, asked for their badge. A Black person is more likely to be assumed to be a wait staff instead of a manager. They're more likely to be turned away from a job opportunity when they show up in person and the manager realizes that they are Black. Yesterday, my husband was telling me a story about a friend of his who is Black and who is a CEO of his own company. And he happened to meet this really influential older white gentleman who does mentoring for CEOs. And he was networking with this man. This man was like so taken with him. He's like, "You're really talented. Listen, I do this event every year for CEOs, like a CEO summit. I want you to come. The tickets for this event are about $700 per person, right?" And the guy says to him, "Look, I got a ticket for you, like a complimentary ticket. Come to the event. I want you to be there." So he shows up at the event, goes to the front desk. There's a woman there, like checking people in. And he says, "Hi, I'm so-and-so. I'm here for the CEO event." And she just looks at him and she's like, "Oh no, your event is down that way." So he goes where she points. He gets into this other event that's in the same building and quickly realizes, no, this is not the event that I'm supposed to be at. So he goes back and he says to her, "No, I'm here for the CEO event." And she's like, "Oh, what's your name?" And then he gives her name. She looks him up on the list and she's like, "Okay, sure. Now go ahead." He gets into the room, goes to a table where some other white people are sitting, and all of the names are on little cards where you should be sitting. So his name is literally at the seat where he should be sitting. And he goes to sit down, and someone at the table says, "Oh, sorry, you must have the wrong event. I think the other event's that way." Now, I want you to think about how this slight interaction, probably I'm sure it was resolved very quickly when he told them his name and then they saw his name on the table. But think about the impact that has on someone, think about the impact that had on him for the rest of the day, for the rest of just even functioning at that event, being able to participate fully, knowing that everyone in here thinks that I don't belong simply because of the color of my skin. These kind of biases, they follow people, candidates particularly, if we're talking about the workplace, into the workplace, and they have a huge impact not only on their experience at that workplace, but it can also impact their chances of success and even how much money they can earn, right? Some stats here for you. Black people are paid significantly less on average than their white counterparts with the same qualifications and educational backgrounds. And studies show that a white candidate with a criminal record has the same chance of getting a job as a Black candidate with no criminal record. So even though you did nothing to create these systems that give you privilege over others, you're not responsible for we know none of us in here created these unfair systems, but we are responsible for what we do with those privileges, right? And I want you to think of your privilege as a superpower. It's something that you have. You didn't ask for it, but you do have it. And you can use it for good or for evil. So I want you to think about what using your privilege looks like. It could look like you being in a meeting where a woman or a BIPOC colleague is being spoken over or discredited or unfairly characterized, and you make a point of calling this out, right? Instead of awkwardly looking away and staying silent when you hear a discriminatory or racist remark, it's you kind of looking your colleagues in the eye and saying, "Hey, like I saw what happened and that was not okay. I have some ideas about what to do, but how can I best help you through this? Or do you even want my help?" And, I want you to know also that privilege is not exclusive to white folks. I know we hear this term a lot, white privilege, but we all have privileges in different ways. Our privileges can shift based on what country we're living in, based on what room we're in, what social circle we're in, what type of job we're in, right? For example, my own privileges, I am a light-skinned Black woman, and that has made my life easier in many ways that are important to acknowledge. I am perceived as biracial, even though I am not biracial. It means that I'm welcomed a lot easier into white corporate spaces because I am seen as less angry, less threatening than a Black woman with darker skin. And I can choose to feel bad or guilty about that, or I can choose to use that privilege to call out this bias. So, for example, I get invited to speak a lot on panels or TV discussions, about racism. And very often I'll notice that all of the Black people on the panel are either biracial or kind of racially ambiguous. And I'll say to the producer, do you realize that you've erased an entirely different lived experience by not having a dark-skinned Black person on this panel? Because their life experience is completely different to mine. And I will make suggestions of other people that they can contact to put on this panel. And if they aren't able to diversify the panel, then I will simply not participate. I will step off of the panel. So that's how, I think, a very small way, but significant way, I, number one, educate, and number two, advocate, right? So I want you to think about what that looks like in your life, right? And if you're still struggling to get around this concept of privilege, I like this quote, that it isn't the presence of perks and benefits, it is the absence of obstacles and barriers. And that's a lot harder to notice. So if you have a hard time recognizing your privileges, focus on what you don't have to go through and let that fuel your empathy and action. So instead of throwing a bunch of content at you today, I thought that I would curate the most common questions that I get around allyship. I thought that would be a more engaging way to chat with you today. And also feel free, you don't have to, we will have a Q&A at the end, but you don't have to wait till I'm done speaking. I'd love for this to be more interactive for the next hour. I can't see the chat while I'm in present mode, but if you do use the hand raise tool, Mary Eleanor, I'll ask you to call on anyone who wants to chat while I'm going through some of these points. Okay. So the first, all good? Anyone want to? Okay, awesome.
No, that was me. That was Mary Eleanor just saying yes.
Perfect.
Happy to. Yeah.
Awesome. Perfect. The first one is this: conversations on race can be awkward. What advice do you have for leaders who want to practice allyship by having these conversations with their teams? Now, I would say that in any hard conversation, any difficult conversation, no matter if it's about race or anything else, right? What I'd recommend is that you set a goal for the conversation. Are you trying to simply speak your own truth? Are you trying to speak your truth and have it heard and understood? Are you trying to persuade someone of a certain fact? Are you trying to get someone to start thinking about something differently, to plant a seed for a future reflection or bring about a certain particular action or response? Or is the purpose of this conversation to address a particular comment or statement? When we don't have a goal, it's much easier for conversations to get derailed, right? And so then we end up having to re-rail them. And re-railing is about getting back on track. It can be especially useful to know, if we're trying to re-rail, where we hope that track is headed, right? So goal setting can minimize our sense of being overwhelmed or at a loss in these conversations by focusing on our contributions, our own contributions in the areas and directions that are most important to us, right? So as a leader, I encourage you to, when you open a conversation, say, hey, today we're here to talk about XYZ. So set the parameters of the conversation and the expectations for what you want to have out of that conversation. Another tactic you can use is, a good old traditional talking stick, whether it's in person or virtually. You can use this in person using an object you pass back and forth among speakers or around a circle for all or part of a given dialogue. Or you can incorporate the principle less formally by asking something like, can I tell you about my experience without interruption? And then I'll listen to yours without interrupting. Or if necessary, you can add further clarification like, if it's okay with you, I'll tell you when I'm done talking, And then you can tell me when you're done. So we're sure we both get to say everything we need to and hear each other fully. Is that okay? You can also use silence. It's a sister of the talking stick. And moments of silence can really help refocus dialogue, calm nerves, and slow down or overcome efforts to derail through distractions or dominating behavior. And the easiest way to get a moment of silence is just to ask for it, saying something like, hey, can we take a moment of silence to all just think about what we've just heard so far and think about what we most want to say? Or something like, this is a hard conversation, and maybe we'd all benefit from a moment of silence to just sit with what we've heard and what we're feeling before we keep going. Or you can say, I want to respond to what you just said, but I have a lot of thoughts and feelings in response, and I want to gather my thoughts so I can speak to you clearly and honestly. So can we take a few moments of silence before we keep going? I think that in my experience in Canadian workplace conversations, generally, people are extremely uncomfortable with silence. And whenever I introduce it, it makes most of my clients very, very uncomfortable. They start texting me right away or messaging me in the chat. What's happening? But silence can really give people the space to practice speedy self-care, slow down the back and forth and reactivity, and gather their thoughts and shift the energy of a conversation. It also can help everyone, including any privileged people in the conversation, to really be more present to the actual content rather than their own status or their reactions in the conversation. Because generally, that's what makes these conversations awkward and makes them go off the rails, when we start becoming more focused on how we are reacting and how we are being perceived, and we lose focus on what we're actually talking about. Mary Eleanor, is there a question?
Yes, there is. There's a question from Kim, and I really appreciate this question. How can a person of privilege assess psychological safety in conversations of allyship?
Yeah. So one thing you'll notice, and this takes a relatively high level of emotional intelligence, right? There's no checklist for this one. This one will come with practice, and it will scare you, because when I say it comes with practice, when I say that, it means that you need to do this knowing that you will very likely get it wrong a few times. And what I mean by that is the only way to get this right is to feel it out, right? So for example, if you hear yourself asking a lot of questions of this person and you're not getting a lot of answers, or you're getting one-word answers, it's very likely they do not feel safe with you. They do not, or if you find that they are laughing nervously, if you find that they are brushing off a serious topic, like if, let's say it's you as a white person, them as a person of color, and you're trying to say, hey, like, you witness them experiencing a microaggression, for example, right? And you're saying to them, yo, like, what was that? Like, oh my gosh, that was terrible. Like, we should do something. And they're like, it's fine. Don't worry about it. That happens all the time. Don't worry about it. That is a cue to you, number one, not to push any much further than acknowledging that you saw what happened and that you did not agree with what happened. As an ally, make your stance clear to that person that you do not support what you observed. That's as far as you need to go in that setting. If you notice, however, that they become open to talking about it, to sharing their emotions about it, if you notice that they start to get emotional or start to say, yeah, you know what, this happens to me all the time. That happened to me last week when this, and this. Listen first. Don't listen to respond. Don't listen to activate right away, right? Let them ask more questions like, wow, that's terrible. How does that impact you? What else? Simple, short questions, open questions that allow them to unburden if they so choose, right? And if they keep speaking, it means that you have now been successful at creating a psychologically safe space for them, because you have not rushed to action. You have not put on that cape and be like, okay, well, I'm going to go straight to HR and I'm going to just, that might scare them because they're still processing what just happened to them. And maybe they don't know if they want to go to HR. Maybe that's not what they want to do, right? So in short, it does take a lot of feeling out, but what I want you to remember the most is not to center your own self in the conversation. That is the most harmful thing that you could do in that situation, is to start crying yourself, start talking about how difficult it was for you to witness that, start talking about, how terrible the world is, and oh my gosh, everything is falling apart. This is the worst day of both of our lives, da 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 da, right? Try as much as you can not to make it about you.
A question here from Jessica, and I do notice there is a hand raised in the chat as well. I will get to you, Suzanne, I promise. So Jessica asked, what is the best approach to white fragility as a response?
Yeah.
Since that situation, the table is turned on the BIPOC individual trying to educate or express.
Mm-hmm. And Marilyn, sorry, are participants able to come off mute themselves?
No, they'll raise their hand and then
just gotcha. Okay, great. I'm sorry, read the last part of the question about.
And maybe Jessica, I might ask you to just clarify. I'm not sure that I have this. There might have been a word missing. It says, what is the best approach to white fragility as a response? Since that situation, the table is turned on the BIPOC individual trying to educate or express. Maybe I'm missing a.
Yeah. No, I think I get the gist, but I'm just curious as to whether the person asking the question is someone who is white and practicing allyship, or someone who is experiencing white fragility when they, as a BIPOC, try to explain an issue to someone. If you are a marginalized person and you have the energy to address something with somebody else, and the response is one that is framed in white fragility. And if anyone is unfamiliar with that term, it really refers to similar to what I alluded to, the crying, this sort of just making this all about you. And it's this sort of like, yeah, I get it, but oh my gosh, look how hard this is for me. Why didn't you tell me this a little bit more nicely? Why are you so upset with me? Why are you attacking me? That's what fragility sounds like, right? Instead of focusing on what you did and how you harmed that person, even though it was most likely unintentionally, the focus now, the spotlight then turns onto you, and then the person who you've harmed ends up usually consoling you, because now they feel awkward that they've made you cry, and they feel bad, and then so the focus is completely lost, right? So for the person who is experiencing that, I will encourage you to resist the urge to comfort that person. It's very difficult because we're human beings, and so even when you're upset, I know for myself, even when I'm upset and I'm expressing it to somebody and they start crying, I feel bad. But it is very important to stay grounded and to move the conversation back to the issue we're talking about. So I'll say things like, if they say, oh, you're so angry, why didn't you, I would have listened better if you said this more nicely. I will say something like, I would like if we could focus less on the way I said something and about what you said, because this is where the harm was created. And I'll try to stay as calm as possible without myself getting emotional. Again, could be very difficult based on what was said, right? But again, to use those re-railing tactics and to bring the conversation back to what was said. Sometimes there is no tactic that will work, because if somebody is committed to not hearing you, there is nothing you can do about that. And so I want you to be empowered to completely walk away from that conversation if you don't feel it's going in a productive way.
So Jessica did include in the chat that they asked from the perspective of a person of color.
Yeah. Okay. I hope my response helped then. Yeah.
And Suzanne, I know that you've added a comment in the chat. And I noticed you also have your hand raised, so I'll just allow you to talk here. So you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Oh, that's perfect.
Hi there. Yeah, I was just thinking that we often ask people, racialized people or marginalized people, to learn the tactics, the skills, the tools on how to raise these issues, on how to raise things that are bothering us in terms of the actions or words that we're hearing or the way that we're being treated. And I think that, and I'd like your feedback on this, I'd like your perspective. Is there also room I think that there is, but what do you think? Is there also room for those who are transgressing, for those who want to perform allyship, that there needs to be learning on that part as well, on how to receive that information? Because I think that a lot of the awkwardness comes from speaking truth to power. And the awkwardness in that is that power always wins. So if I'm speaking truth to power, it's like, why am I talking to my manager this way? Or why am I talking to my mother-in-law this way? Or whatever the case may be. There's a truth to power element there. So I just wanted to get your perspective. You know, the education being on the part of the individual receiving that feedback, and like, suspend your white fragility, or suspend your fragility or your privilege for a moment, recognize it and accept it and believe what you're hearing, which is what I put it. So I wasn't sure if we were going to go into it.
100%. What I would say, and just to put this in simple terms, right? And I find that when talking to white folks or any folks of major privilege, the easier way to wrap your mind around this is to think about your ego, right? Because this is something we all have, right? And I want you to think about figuring out a way in these conversations to drop your ego and to suspend judgment, because what your ego inherently pushes you to do is to judge and to protect yourself, right? And I want you to take a moment to drop that. And when I say suspend judgment, I mean that just because something hasn't happened to you doesn't mean it is not real. I want you to consider that even if this person is your peer or your friend, your colleague, who you perceive to be on the same level as you, you're like, well, we both work here. You know, clearly you have privileges too. You made it here. What's the problem? I want you to consider that that person has had wildly different experiences and hurdles to jump over in order to sit beside you at this desk. I want you to refrain from matching in the conversation, which means if they say to you, you know, I've had to work, twice as hard to get where I am, or I feel underleveled here at this company. I feel like I have all these qualifications, but I can't get to the role that I want. I feel like people don't take me seriously. I feel like this, and this. And you come back with, well, yeah, that happens to all of us. That happens to me too. It's that essentially what you are doing is matching in order to avoid your discomfort. And the discomfort that is coming up for you is likely because you have never had to examine how your race or your gender or your abilities impact your life chances. Because very likely they haven't. They haven't impacted your life chances. But if you are Black or queer or trans or disabled, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, these parts of your identity most likely have impacted your life chances. And so it is very prominent in your psyche, right? Whereas for a person who hasn't experienced these things are nowhere in their psyche. So it's very difficult to bring these two people to a meeting place where one person has been like, that's ridiculous. That could never happen. This is 2022. That's impossible. Right? Here, so the person who's saying, no, this happened to me today. This happened to me last week. This happened to my mother and her mother, and it's still happening to me, and it happened to my kid. These are, as you can now imagine, these are two very different realities, right? So the person in this reality needs to drop that and realize that, as you said, believe, because these things do happen. That's the best advice I can give for that. Hope that helps.
Thank you very much.
And I do see a hand raised by Julio, and I do want to just address two questions that came in prior to their hand. One from Amina. How do you suggest navigating conversations where a person in a position of privilege, both in their job, role, and society, use the right language, in quote, the right language, but their allyship isn't meaningful or doesn't go beyond words?
Yeah. One of the questions I have later on is around performative allyship. But I'll answer that question directly in that it will take a lot of courage on your end to point out to that person that they are practicing performative allyship. And it's not a long answer I'm going to give you, because it has to be very short and direct. You have to literally say to them, you said this, but you haven't done this. You've given me lots of words, but allyship is about solidarity, and that means action. So where is the action? It's a very pointed question that you have to ask.
Some questions from, and I'd welcome you unmuting yourself to clarify how you pronounce your name. So Sobia or Sobaya. I'm just wondering how this works with people you have to work with all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't this ruin the environment? And then there are a few follow-up questions that I'll just add to that, Camille, if I can.
Sure.
What if you don't want to hurt people's feelings,
Mm-hmm.
but address the racism directly? And how do you differentiate between empathy and matching?
Mm-hmm. I'll go backwards. There's a very thin line between empathy and sympathy. The sympathy is more the matching, right? And having empathy is it's difficult in this scenario because it's very difficult for us as humans to listen without responding. So I want you to practice this as much as you can. Practice it at home, with your children, with your spouse, with friends. Practice asking them a question and listening without responding of your own experience. Oh yeah, that happened to me too. Oh yeah, when I was younger, this isn't I do that with my kids all the time. And I'm like, stop it. Right? It's human. So it takes a lot of practice to listen without matching. That is what empathy looks like. So it's like asking, again, more open-ended questions. Tell me about how that plays out for you. Or if you, for example, are a white male, it's about leaning into vulnerability and saying to that person, you know what? As a white man, I actually don't know anything about how this feels. Tell me about what that's like for you. Instead of trying to find some other experience in your life that you think could possibly match what that person has gone through and thinking that that's going to help the situation. We do these things with the best of intentions, right? So that's what it looks like. That's the difference between empathy and sympathy, right? When you don't want to hurt people's feelings, but your feelings are already hurt. When you have experienced a microaggression or racism or any type of discriminatory act of exclusion, you have been hurt. And so I challenge us to think about why we are then prioritizing the feelings of the person who have harmed us. That's what we need to grapple with first. Why we do not feel empowered, why we have accepted living in a dynamic that prevents us from being open and honest about when we are harmed. It also speaks to a wider issue of our workplace culture. And so this is something that leaders need to take note of. In what have we done to create a culture, or what have we not done to create a culture where people feel safe to say, I think that you probably didn't mean that the way that it came out, but here's how it impacted me. What is it that we're doing? Are we having too many knee-jerk reactions? So for example, if someone reports that that their manager or their colleague said something discriminatory to them, do we just fire that person right away and create this culture of fear so that no one else wants to report again because they don't want to be the one that gets that person fired? Or are we creating a culture of communication where we can have a lead up to that process? Yes, we can fire people when they need to be fired. But before we do that, can we have some type of reconciliation? Can we have some type of education first? Can we talk about what happened? What specific things are we doing to create these environments where I'm not going to have to prioritize? I'm going to have to think about that person's feelings. Because I can say, hey, I have some type of shared experience or shared a central reference point, because maybe we've all been through this course together. Maybe we've all been through this training together. Maybe we have something that we can, some documents or policies we can refer to that I can say, hey, remember when we did this course? Or remember when we built this policy together? Remember when we talked about exclusion and this and that? Yeah, that wasn't cool. That didn't align with what we learned, or that doesn't align with the type of environment we're trying to create for each other. I know you didn't intend it that way, but here's the impact it had on me.
A question here from Julio, and I'll just unmute them. And then I'd love for Camille as to perhaps if you want to continue walking us through your presentation, and then we can open up for other questions as well. So I'll just unmute you here. Julio, sorry for the wait. Feel free to unmute.
No problem. Hi, folks.
Hi.
I have a question regarding the term white violence. Is that comparable to white fragility? And what does that mean to putting the power back to those are coming from privilege, when words mean so much and oftentimes used negatively to either empower or take away from those who are marginalized?
It is related, but it is different in the sense that what it refers to is the weaponization of that fragility. So when we talk about white tears, for example, right? And the reason the word the history of the word violence, right, is significant when juxtaposed with white. Because if we think about something like white tears, particularly white women, the historical context of that, if you don't know the historical context of that, you might feel very alarmed by that term. But where that is coming from is that pre-slavery, post-slavery, Jim Crow days, a white woman simply had to shed a few tears and accuse a Black man of looking at her the wrong way, or of sexually assaulting her, or of whatever, and that man would be lynched. And so the way that plays out now in a modern context, we don't have, lynchings anymore. We may have them in different ways, but the way that plays out in the workplace is Black people left feeling that you can be justified in criticizing somebody or criticizing something, but if one of your white female colleagues is offended by what you said and cries, then suddenly you are the villain and you are the troublemaker and you will get fired or you will get sanctioned. That's how that plays out in a workplace setting. Does that make sense, Julio?
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
Hey,
awesome questions. You guys are amazing. This question, sometimes I feel like I'm preaching to the choir. How do I get others to care about issues like allyship or equity, especially when they feel like these issues don't impact them? And I'll offer an analogy. I just mentioned Jim Crow laws a while ago. We all know about Jim Crow laws in the US, like swimming pools that were for white people only. And by the way, and this is something we touch on in the course as well, we had those kind of segregation laws in Canada too, right? But in the US, when towns started facing integration orders from courts, when they were dismantling Jim Crow laws, right? And pools were one of them that they were forced to integrate. But many of these towns, they simply drained the pool rather than allow Black people to swim in them. So what you started seeing was the explosion of backyard pools and expensive private membership swim clubs popping up all over the place. But of course, only a small percentage of white people could afford this, right? There are lots of poor and middle-class white people who could not afford that. And so what did that mean? It meant that Black people and a whole lot of poor and middle-class white folk didn't have access to these public pools anymore. And if you think of the pool as the workplace, for me, it's a metaphor, a great visual metaphor for the importance of an inclusive workplace, because it's a reminder that when we decide to drain the pool, resources, opportunities, it impacts all races of people, all abilities of people. When we decide to simply open the gates of the pool, it also impacts and in fact benefits everyone. So it's up to you. Would you rather have no pool or a pool that everyone can swim in? We talked a little bit about performative allyship, but I'll give two specific examples. And my first answer to this, how do we avoid performative allyship, is simply by acknowledging uncomfortable truths. And so whenever you're struggling with doing something or putting out a piece of communication, whether it's on social media or a press release or whatever, a memo, I want you to ask yourself, what uncomfortable truths live here? And am I acknowledging them? Orange Shirt Day is a good example to think about this. National Day for Truth and Reconciliation was a holiday aimed to recognize the government's wrongdoings by rewarding federal employees with a paid holiday. Okay, let's put that aside. But that same government refuses to drop the challenge of a Canadian Human Rights Tribunal decision that orders Ottawa to compensate Indigenous children removed from their homes. That same government is still not providing clean drinking water, is still stealing resources from Indigenous people. Just last year, I read that Parliament passed a motion to recognize the genocide of Muslim Uyghurs in China, which is a fantastic move. But realizing we have yet to recognize the genocide of Indigenous children right here in Canada. And it was so striking to me that the crimes which led Canada to make this recognition in China of genocide are the very same crimes committed against Indigenous children here. Forcible removal from homes, mandatory boarding schools, removal of their original names, being prevented from speaking their native language, all with the intent of destroying this group of people entirely. So it's performative allyship when we're willing to sport orange shirts, but not willing to speak openly about these truths, right? Someone asked me a couple of days ago about something like Bell Let's Talk Day. And in the news, it's become very apparent through a series of stories and resignations from women and people of color who work for Bell Media, who have suffered, whose mental health has suffered at the hands of their employer as Bell Media. We also, so there's a direct conflict there, a direct, something that doesn't add up there. Also, when you see, Bell raising money for this, but also taking advantage of marginalized groups in our society, like people in prison, where they have to pay like 3 times, I think, the regular rate of a phone call to call someone from prison. These are real things that exist. And so do we just ignore them and don't talk about them and just retweet and, hey, Bell, let's talk mental health. Okay, yeah, we're all about that. But we're ignoring that this employer is impacting their own employees' mental health? Or can we live in a world where, yes, we can participate in a campaign that supports mental health, but we also have the courage to say, hey, Bell, but what about this? Or why don't you scrap these soaring fees for people in prison who can't afford them? Like, why can't we support, but also critique? Because it does end up being empty and hollow words when we ignore these very realities that are not going anywhere. Now, a huge component of avoiding performative allyship is also knowing how to be accountable when you have harmed someone. And that involves knowing how to apologize from a place that doesn't further harm them or center your own emotions. So I'm going to share this guide with you from a colleague of mine. Her name is Rania El Mugamar. And this is one of the many downloadable resources that is included in the course. And she calls it the anatomy of an apology. First is the acknowledgement, then the emotional uptake, creating space for them to feel their feelings without being policed on the appropriateness or the intensity of their emotional response. That's what I talked about earlier, not saying, well, you're just too angry. Center their hurts. It's not about your own feelings of guilt. It's about the feelings and the needs of the person that you have harmed. Accountability and change behavior. Take ownership of your actions naming them, and changing the identified problematic behaviors, right? So if you just apologize, but then don't commit to doing anything differently, it's pointless. The last one is the hardest for me: divest from forgiveness, because I'm probably like a lot of people here. I want to know that you forgive me before I end this conversation. It'll help me sleep better. But it's not about that, right? It was so difficult for me to apologize, to practice apologizing without forgiveness as my end goal. Very, very difficult, but needed. Lastly, how do we keep the momentum going around allyship? Because I feel like everyone in here is here because they're invested in this, but you have probably already experienced what it feels like to have that slowdown, to have that, well, yeah, this doesn't feel like a priority anymore, right? And so the way you actively keep this about in your day, right, is in any given situation, asking yourself, whether you're in a meeting, whether you're at a town hall, or you're just coming up with a new campaign or a new product or whatever, who is not included? Whose voice have we not heard yet? Who is benefiting? Who is losing from this decision, from this product, from this strategy? And I'll put those questions up on the screen for you if you need them. And ultimately, what these questions are getting you to do is to challenge your own beliefs, which is very difficult to do. I'll share one that was difficult for me, and it's around pay equity. Now, I'm Black, I'm a woman. So if you ask me if I support pay equity, of course I support pay equity, right? And when I started to challenge my own beliefs, and it was through a conversation I was having with someone, I can't remember how it came up, but I realized that I held the belief that if I am knowledgeable and capable enough to negotiate a higher salary in an interview, then I deserve that higher salary. That's a belief I've held for a long time. I'm like, well, why not? Until I started to challenge that and interrogate that. And then I started to think, well, hang on. Okay, what if no one ever told me that, hey, in a North American workplace setting, you don't ever accept the first offer. You also lie about what you made on your last job. That's just how we do things here. What if no one ever told me that? What if I came from a culture where we do not question what authority has handed to us? It's disrespectful. It doesn't show initiative. It's the opposite of all those things in our culture. Why then should that simple knowledge gap separate me from somebody who has the same skills as me, or even has more skills than me? Why do I deserve more than them? Just because I happen to know that. It's not fair. I'll leave you with this fantastic breakdown of the word ally from Kayla Reed, who heads up a racial justice organization in the US. A, always center the impacted. Listen and learn from those who live in oppression. Leverage your privilege and yield the floor. And remember that allyship without solidarity, without action, does more to help you feel good about yourself than it does to dismantle systems of oppression. This is something we talk more about in the course, with the difference between allyship and solidarity, and why you can't effectively have one without the other. But before you sign up for the course, if you do, I want you to form an accountability team. Could be just you and one other person, someone at work or outside of work that you want to take this journey with, that you can check in with and hold each other to task on how you are each practicing allyship. Be there to give each other grace and room to grow when you falter. And remember that this isn't about knowing everything or memorizing all the right terms and words to use. It is about how do you respond when you're faced with something you don't know, a new term, a term you've never heard of, a term you thought was totally inclusive. How do you respond? when you have to face recognizing your own privilege, if you're a person who thought, I don't have privilege, but then you realize, oh, whoa, here I do, how do you respond? When you're confronted with the impact of harming someone, even when you didn't mean to, can you respond with empathy? Can you respond with grace? Can you respond without centering yourself and your feelings? And if you are ready to start the course, there are 2 questions I want you to keep in mind around allyship. One, what are you doing to create a work environment where team members feel safe to share information about their own lived experiences, or feel safe to point out when they have been excluded or harmed? And 2, do your team members even talk about what allyship with solidarity looks like in your particular workplace? What does that look like for you? Some things that you can start doing. Commit to your self-education. Becoming a better ally starts with deep listening. People practicing allyship begin by carefully looking and noticing the differences and similarities between themselves and others. They take the time first to understand their own privilege, and they listen to the experiences and needs of others. Only after that do you start to engage in active allyship, when you appreciate the values of these differences and you can act accordingly. Again, challenge your own biases. That self-reflection piece. None of us are bias-free. Rather, people practicing allyship are more likely to be aware of the gap between what they should do and what they actually do, and then work to close that gap, right? Working for the greater good and not for your self-image. I read an interesting study that showed that allies who are motivated by goals that transcend themselves and were about wider social transformation are more likely to affect meaningful change than people who are motivated by selfish motives. So those who want to help call out systems of oppression to dismantle them for all, rather than doing so just to look good or to say, oh yeah, or to put that ally flag on your desk, right? If you don't feel ready to register the course as yet, please don't let that be an impediment to your education. I'm going to share this with you. I've compiled my top 10 resources for both visual and audio, as well as reading material. The biggest step you can take as someone stepping into allyship is to educate yourself. Without an understanding of these issues, you will continue to engage in performative allyship because you know all the right words, all the right phrases, but you don't truly understand the context of where it all sits. The course, of course, if you do feel ready to enroll, feel free to email me directly on LinkedIn or by email with any questions. The course will help you build knowledge on topics of equity, diversity, and inclusion, and help you develop the skills and the confidence and the capacity to really make intentional changes in how you communicate in the workplace. It's pretty broad in the topics that it covers. And we have a team of 6 other facilitators who have their own unique lived experience that you can tap into during the live session. So you'll get to hear from their perspectives as an Indigenous woman or a non-binary person or as a white male practicing allyship. So there's a lot to learn, and you can learn it in many different ways and from different voices. Okay, I know I've given you a lot to think about, and hopefully we still have a few minutes for some more questions or comments.
Right, and there are some great questions, mainly, and I hope that I can cover a lot of the questions with one answer, which is that an email will go out to all of you who attended today, and those who weren't able to join us today. An email will go out before the end of your workday in a few hours with a link to today's recording of the webinar. We host it on our YouTube channel. So if that doesn't arrive in your inbox, check your junk, check your clutter. It will be there, and you'll be able to rewatch the webinar. And there were a lot of questions about, can we get that take action slide?
Yes.
That has the list of reading, watching, listening. So
yep, I'm going to send
Camille, it. Yeah, it'd be great if you could maybe send that over to me, and we can include it in the email that will go out this afternoon. Otherwise, you can certainly pause on that part in the webinar and jot down all of the suggestions. It's a great set of resources. There are a few questions, lots of thank yous coming in the chat, which is lovely. And thank you so much, Camille. I echo what everyone is saying in the chat here. Lots of information to digest and think about. And I do want to go back to a few questions that were posed earlier in the chat. And apologies if I've missed anyone. There's a question about maybe if you could speak a bit more about the difference between being white and decentering whiteness.
Well, being white, you're just white. There's nothing to do about that. And there's nothing, I also want to underscore that there's nothing to feel guilty or ashamed of for being white. I think that is very often conflated with the concept of whiteness. And whiteness actually does not simply refer to skin color. It refers to a system that centers. And when I say centers, I mean prioritizes and sets being white as the default. And everything else must conform to that. It's difficult to see that when you're just operating as a white person, right? Like you're just, living your life. It's difficult to see, but when you start to examine the experiences of people of color, I'll give you a quick one. I think I have this one in the course, but it was a story I read about a Black disabled mother in Vancouver. And her baby is an amputee. And as he has one leg. And as he was, becoming a toddler, trying to learn how to walk, he would fall over and hurt himself. Of course, he would get bruises and bleeding and everything. She took him to a doctor to get fitted for a prosthetic. And at first they said to her, oh, you know what? It's not worth it. Just let him adapt. And she wasn't sure if they said that because they felt she couldn't afford something or she couldn't, whatever it was. Anyway, she said, no, I'm not leaving here until you fit my child for a prosthetic. And he was nursing age at the time. And she sat there and was nursing him in the doctor's office. And they told her to leave and she refused to leave. And then they threatened to call the police. She said, go ahead. Eventually they relented and they said, fine, okay, we will fit him for this prosthetic. Come back in 6 weeks. She comes back in 6 weeks and the prosthetic leg is white. And she tries to explain to the doctor, why this is a problem. And he's like, well, I don't see color. And even when she continued to try to explain to him, right, he just could not understand why a white mother would never be given a prosthetic that's Black. That just wouldn't happen. So keep that in your mind. That we just expect we have white as the norm, as the standard. And you should just be grateful for that. You should just accept that. But we would never do it the other way around. Suddenly we see the problem. We would never do it the other way around. And that is the harm of whiteness.
There's one other question, and I know we're winding down our time together. Question, how do we acknowledge injustice externally without perpetrating trauma?
Oh, yeah. And it's important to keep justice at our core in all we do. Checking in with people and also not assuming that everybody wants to tell their story. And thinking of other ways. Okay, big picture and then small picture. Big picture is sometimes we think that, especially if we're in the nonprofit sector, right? I see this a lot in the nonprofit, where we rely a lot on storytelling, right? And we feel that we can't get those people to donate. We can't get those people to subscribe without these sob stories. And I want you to think about what that perpetuates about us as humans. That we can't read or watch a documentary or understand an issue without feeling like saviors. I want you to look up the term white saviorism. We don't have time to go into it now, but that is very connected to the question that you just asked. And and I had this difficult discussion with a particular nonprofit who dealt with children. And I was trying to show them how this sort of gala they have every year, where it's all very rich people, and then they bring out 2 of their underprivileged children, who are usually children of color, to stand in front of this entire room and tell their life story of being unhoused, of being abused, of being this and then that. And then everyone cries, and then everyone claps, and everyone gives money. And I asked them to think about the impact that has on that child. And they were very defensive about it, right? Mm-hmm. Being like, well, like this is what we need. And the children are always, willing, and we do this or whatever. I'm like, I want you to really think about the impact it has on them. And are they really in a decision-making power? Decision-making, you know what I'm trying to say? Are they in a place where they can say no, right? Because you're like, oh, it's their choice. But as a child with somebody who has given you services, are you going to say no to that? So think about the balance of power is what I'm saying.
I know we've just passed 1 minute of our time together. I just, as a way of kind of summing up, I'm sure how a lot of you are feeling. Just a comment here from Ellen and from Barbara. This was a fantastic presentation, one of the most practical in terms of concrete tips that I've ever attended. And Barbara echoes that by saying this is one of the best presentations I've ever attended. And I couldn't agree more, Camille. It's such a pleasure to hear you speak. It's such a pleasure to read the comments and to listen to your responses to questions that don't always have a really concrete or clear answer. And thank you, everyone, for your honesty and for asking questions. And we will be sending around an email later today with a link to Camille's course. I did include it in the chat, and would encourage you to watch the video that's added there in the course description that summarizes what you can get out of the course. And it is one that you can take, begin and finish at your own pace. But it does include, if you take it as an individual, it does include opportunities to tune into live Q&A sessions with Camille, very similar to, or a similar setting to today's webinar. So I thank you all so much. And thank you again, Camille, for your time. I hope that you're feeling better. I hope that your cold goes away soon.
And no, there are no prerequisites to taking the course. I just saw that in the Q&A, and I will absolutely, as soon as I get off the call, collate these slides, like in just the action ones, and I will send them out immediately.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Camille. We'll include that in the email. So stay tuned for that email. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day, wherever you are in Canada. And for those outside of Canada, just thanks for tuning in, and take care.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.